Hi, my name is Dwayne Gathers. Welcome to Civitas LA, featuring diverse and emerging leaders who make up this dynamic region and are creating community every day and building a better tomorrow. In these bi-weekly conversations, we get to hear from, learn from, and be inspired by a new generation of civic entrepreneurs who are forging a path forward in making Los Angeles a stronger, more resilient, and connected group of citizens. Now more than ever, our aim is simple: to elevate civic discourse, foster community connections, and promote civic knowledge and engagement across the greater Los Angeles region while elevating diverse and emerging voices in that conversation. The respected Brookings Institution issued a report in November 2019 entitled "Local Journalism is in Crisis: Why America Must Revive Its Local Newsrooms." It notes, thousands of local newspapers have closed in recent years. Their disappearance has left millions of Americans without a vital source of local news and deprived communities of an institution essential for exposing wrongdoing and encouraging civic engagement. Of those still surviving, many have laid off reporters, reduced coverage, and pulled back circulation. It further notes, the local news crisis has also precipitated a general disengagement from local democratic life. As Americans have shifted away from local news, turnout in state and local elections has fallen, and communities that have lost reporters have seen fewer candidates run for local office. That being said, we are delighted to be joined in studio this afternoon by Jim Newton, former editorial page editor and columnist with the Los Angeles Times, to discuss the state of local news coverage of our communities and impacts on civic knowledge and engagement. Over a distinguished 25-year career, Jim served as a reporter, editor, bureau chief, columnist, and editor of editorial pages, and along the way won a Pulitzer Prize or two. Few have had such a front row seat observing and covering civic life in our region, Los Angeles, as Jim has. Jim, welcome to Civitas LA.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's nice to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here on this wonderful sunny afternoon. So, Jim, as we begin, we always appreciate it if the guest will share with us a brief personal introduction.
Well, my name is Jim Newton, and I thank you for the introduction you've already given me. I was born in Northern California, grew up all around the place, went to high school in Palo Alto, went to Dartmouth College, where you and I met.
Go Big Green.
Indeed. And then after that, worked for a year as clerk to James Reston at the New York Times. Then I worked for a year on the foreign desk at the Times. I worked for the Atlanta Constitution for a few years, and then came to L.A. And I must say, Los Angeles, pretty much the last place I ever imagined living and working growing up in Northern California, but it's worked out okay. So I've been here for, 30 years now.
Dodgers or Giants?
Giants all the way.
Okay.
Not a close call for me.
Okay, let's get that out of the way. So, Jim, that's great. So, you've been here 30 years, so we always love to get to know our guests a little bit more through your Los Angeles. So in these lightning round questions, share with us a glimpse of some of your LA favorites. Are you ready?
Got it.
Give us a favorite restaurant or two.
Damien, I just ate at recently. New restaurant downtown, kind of modern Mexican food. Love it. Highly recommend.
And already a favorite. Okay.
Already a favorite, yeah.
Favorite watering hole?
I got sober 3 years ago, so I don't do the watering hole scene much anymore. But
okay, that's fine. We move on. Favorite place to take a visitor?
Disney Hall is my favorite building and place in Los Angeles, so I would take a visitor there if I could.
Excellent. Share with us a hidden gem, something very few people know about.
Something I walk through the sculpture garden almost every day at UCLA on the way from the parking lot to my office, and I must say it's a beautiful, quiet, secluded place in the middle of a busy campus and a busy city.
That's wonderful. So give us a favorite hike or park, since outdoor space is so prevalent here in Los Angeles.
Well, Griffith Park, of course, hard to beat, although I must say I live out in Pasadena, and the hills right above my house are also quite gorgeous. So there's a lot of places to take in the city.
Well, that's wonderful. So, Jim, let's get started here. Give us a sense of how you got started in journalism and what excited you about journalism.
I started working in journalism as a sophomore in high school, so I've been doing this for a while now. The appeal has always been the same, which is a chance to participate in and observe civic life at all levels without some of the compromises that go with politics itself. So it's been an opportunity to write about politics and government and schools and culture and observe them up close and get to chronicle them. It's been a joy. I started, as I say, in high school, did it in college, did it ever since. Even now, I'm at UCLA, but I teach both journalistic ethics and writing, and I run Blueprint Magazine, which is an attempt to put into practice some of those ideas in covering public policy and politics in California. So it's a through line in my life for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly you spent 25 years with our hometown newspaper, the Los Angeles Times. So give our audience a sense of your time at the Times and how your various roles evolved over those years.
My first job at the Los Angeles Times was covering the city of Mission Viejo for the Orange County edition of the Los Angeles Times.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was a long time ago. I came here from the Atlanta Constitution, and the Orange County edition of the Los Angeles Times was about the same size as the entire Atlanta Constitution in those days. It was huge. I was hired in the Orange County edition and began worked there for a year without ever even coming to Los Angeles. It was a very standalone, autonomous operation within the LA Times. From there, I came downtown. I moved downtown early 92, I think it was. I covered federal law enforcement at first, and then I added LAPD to that. Did that for 5 years. Covered City Hall for many years after that, then took over our coverage of city and county government. We had what was called the City County Bureau. I was the bureau chief there for a while. Took a couple leaves of absence to write books, but then wound up as the editor of the editorial pages in 2006. Served in that job for several years. Then I became editor at large, did that job and worked as a columnist for a few years, and then moved over to UCLA in 2015.
Wow, what a career. So as we focus this episode and your role in covering community, and you've had a front row seat covering this particular region, I first want to get your thoughts, on the pandemic and the role the pandemic has had on local newspapers. Certainly reports suggest that many papers have had to either go out of business or cut costs, but that trend started before 2020. So share your insights on this trend and thoughts on some of its major causes.
Yeah, well, the trend predates the pandemic for sure. There are a lot of things that contribute to the difficulties of the economics of journalism right now, but they relate to, among other things, the collapse of the classified ad business as a result of Craigslist. So that the economics of that went away pretty quickly. The retail business has been in great trouble, and the retail business provides a lot of advertising for newspapers. Just the content possibilities of the internet, which are magnificent for free speech and for free expression, but are difficult in that they have acclimated readers and consumers to getting their information for free. And it's not free to produce. So we are caught between cultural ideas, one that information is valuable and one that information is free. Throw a pandemic into that and everything gets worse. The pandemic obviously caused huge disruptions in the economy, and including in the retail industry. So some of the same pressures that were already at work were amplified by the pandemic. And it has created a really very difficult situation for newspapers at all levels. Interestingly, for a while, very local papers kind of held up better than some of the national papers, only because they didn't have national advertising to lose. And so when that advertising base went away, it didn't affect them as deeply. But I think at this point, the problems are so widespread and endemic that no newspaper has emerged without damage.
But talk about the role of hedge funds in particular, because it's estimated that hedge funds alone own approximately 50% of local newspapers. And earlier this year, in February, the Wall Street Journal ran a report saying that the current owner of the Times was in talks to sell the paper to a notable hedge fund. So the Times said it was a rumor. They're still in local hands. But I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this trend and the impact on local newsrooms and local coverage.
Yeah, well, listen, anytime you've got an owner who's principally interested in squeezing it for the bottom line is going to be bad for journalism. And since that's what hedge funds do, that's bad for journalism. That has not come to pass at the LA Times, I'm happy to say. It does remain in the hands of a local owner. And that has helped protect it from some of the squeezing that would go on otherwise. Many newspapers, the Chicago Tribune among them, have ended up in the hands of hedge funds. And I've never seen that end well.
Well, I know, a lot of studies have pointed to the fact that local newspapers and media are a necessary ingredient in a healthy democracy. And due to the lack of local sources, bloggers and podcasters and others have attempted to fill the vacuum in certain regions, especially here in Los Angeles. How do you view this trend, and what are the opportunities?
Listen, I think that there is there's no evidence that there's a decreased public demand for solid information. The public wants it. And so if newspapers are in a position that they can't deliver it, then I think other sources will rise to fill that. The problem there is that there's certain kinds of information that newspapers, at least historically, have been, if not uniquely, at least unusually well situated to provide. Some kind of reporting is just expensive. It is very hard to cover a region like the Southern California with a blog, as you probably know better than anyone. It's hard with a podcast. It's hard with a blog. It's hard to be an individual producer and get to the dozens of cities that exist in Los Angeles County, much less the deep level investigative reporting or the beat reporting. Certainly the kind of work I did. I would spend, I was a fairly productive reporter, but there would be weeks that would go by where I wouldn't be in the paper because I'd be off investigating something. And the LA Times kept paying my salary while I did that. In fact, wanted me to do that. I had colleagues who were out of the paper for years at a time, working on very deep investigative projects. So that's difficult reporting to sustain if you're a small operation. And because it's difficult to sustain, it doesn't really happen in the absence of a large news organization. Now, whether that large news organization distributes on paper or on the web or over TV, that seems to me to be sort of incidental. It's not the paper itself that makes a newspaper. It's the news organization. And the challenge is that it's expensive to run a large news organization. And without those large news organizations, there is a certain kind of coverage that suffers. And that's unfortunately what's happened.
As we've gone to these digital formats, are you still a print guy or are you a digital guy?
Well, I'm a print guy, but I don't require that anyone else be a print guy just because I am. Listen, I still, my New York Times arrives every morning. In fact, our dog is trained to go out and pick up the New York Times, so she brings it on in. That's just going to be me for good, But my students at UCLA, I ask them to read the paper so that we can talk about it. They do. They're very well informed. They're smart young people. Yeah. I don't think any of them actually gets it delivered to their door, though. Yeah. And as I say, that's okay as long as the business model supports the reporting. I'm not romantic about the paper itself. I am insistent on the journalism, but the journalism can exist in lots of different forms.
Well, I'm with you. I'm old school. I like the newspaper itself with my coffee in the morning.
You and I will be the two last ones.
Yeah, exactly. So, with all of this, many people have turned to social media for their news and information sharing. Obviously, there's been this rise in misinformation. So I'd like your thoughts on the rise of social media, the rise of misinformation, and how does social media, how do we combat this on these platforms?
Yeah, really big and hard to answer question. Social media is I think a great and fascinating development in our lives. It clearly provides ways for people to communicate and connect with each other that just weren't available 10, 15, 20 years ago. So that's all to the good. But all the things that make it exciting and adventurous and open also make it undisciplined and unruly and difficult. It's very hard to tell the difference between a credible piece of information and a fiction in social media. I hope that people are developing a kind of literacy around this and recognizing that there's a difference between credible news and misinformation. But we're not there yet, that's for sure. I mean, the absurdity of watching millions of people in this country refuse to be vaccinated based on misinformation that they're receiving is tragic. It's literally costing hundreds of thousands of lives. I mean, so this is not a small problem for society. I hope that we will get better at it. I think it's a very difficult problem. We get better at it, meaning recognizing the difference between credible information and misinformation. I think it's a very difficult problem to regulate away. The First Amendment makes it very difficult for the government to pick, sort of credible sources and differentiate them, help you differentiate them from non-credible sources. So I think it's going to have to be consumers and education that ultimately help us make those distinctions smartly. It's very tempting to make the social media companies responsible for patrolling this, but I got to tell you, I'm not a lot more comfortable with a Google executive telling me what's credible than I am with a government official telling me what's credible. So I think in the end, I think it's going to have to be incumbent on everyday people to make smart judgments. And that's slow coming, that's for sure.
So I'm wondering if this all flows into the whole, lack of trust in institutions overall. So, next year, of course, here in Los Angeles, we've got municipal elections, and we've had notoriously low voter turnout in municipal elections, and the years have been changed to even years so that we get on presidential cycles and governor cycles, et cetera. So this Brookings report also noted that the connection between the shift away from local news and decline in the number of candidates that run for local office, as well as low voter participation in state and local elections. What do you think of these trends and its impact on civic knowledge and participation in the local process here, particularly in Los Angeles?
Yeah, all worthy questions for civic debate. The first, just to return to your first point, the even-numbered year elections. I have some mixed feelings about the shift to the even number years. I do think it will increase turnout, but I also think it will decrease public concentration on those races. One of the advantages of the odd year election for mayor and for council members and other city offices has been that even though the turnout has been small, the coverage has been very focused. So I think it's for just as a former editor at the LA Times, I can tell you you could take your reporters who were covering the presidential or the gubernatorial and move them over to the city cycle and let them cover it. So voters got the benefit of all of that newspaper attention and resources.
Gotcha.
Now that's all going to be split with these other races. So while there will, I think, be more actual votes cast in a municipal election, I don't know that means that voters will have paid more attention to that election. And that's too bad. Now, it may end out that it's just as well if we have bigger turnout. Maybe that counteracts the fact that they're sort of below the line kind of races. So overall, there may be some good in it too.
Well, let me stop you there. I do know that from a couple of local candidates in the 2020 cycle that they were concerned about being in that cycle because they thought the municipal elections would be at the very bottom of the ballot.
That's right.
And people just don't have the attention span to go from president, Senate on down. So
that's reflected at all levels of the process, right? So one will be, that's called ballot drop-off, right? That people will just sort of lose interest as they work their way down the ballot. But related to that is just attention drop-off. How many races do we think voters will pay attention to at once? And will they pay the same attention to a city council race if it's in a cycle where there's also a governor's race? My guess is probably not. But maybe they'll vote anyway, and there may be some benefits just to having bigger turnout. But just more people voting doesn't solve any particular problem. What we really aspire to is more races that are thoroughly covered and voters who are thoroughly informed and want to vote and go out and vote. And I don't know that we've figured out the recipe for that quite
right.
yet.
No, it's a good perspective. So I know in 2018 when Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong bought the LA Times and the San Diego Union Tribune, the Times actually, elevated the number of employees and hired over 150 journalists. And having been away from the Times for a few years, how do you view those developments and how that's impacted, their coverage of this region?
I think it can only be to the good. A bigger Times is better than a smaller Times. When I came to the LA Times in 1989, there were about not quite 1,300 people on the news staff. 1,280 is the number that I recall from a distant past.
Okay.
Now
that's very specific. I like that.
Right. Well, and that may be off by a few, but it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,300. Now, I don't know the exact number, but my guess is it's between 500 and 600 probably.
Wow.
So that's a lot better than 400, and we can thank Dr. Soon-Shiong for that and for arresting what was a really precarious situation for the paper. But it's also true that the paper that I came to that I described a few minutes ago with an Orange County edition the size of the Atlanta Constitution, that's just not the case anymore. And it's not going to be the case anytime soon. So that kind of blanket coverage of the region that the paper once had is just not possible now. That's where other sources come in, and there are other ways that people are getting information about some of these smaller communities. But I think it's just not realistic or feasible for the Los Angeles Times to place reporters in every community in this region. It can't afford to do so, and that's too bad, but that's life.
Right. So, thinking about the inability to place reporters in all these communities, let's think about who they're placing in these communities, because last summer, as you know, as the protests over the George Floyd death occurred, the LA Times had their own conversations, their own reckoning with regards to how they handled race and also their own hiring practices and how they covered communities. Can you speak to your time at the Times and how the importance of representation in covering the diverse communities of Los Angeles?
Yeah, well, it's a vitally important issue, one that was talked about my entire time at the paper. I recall in the aftermath of the riots in 1992, really serious conversations within the paper about what the staff looked like, whether we were representative of these communities, and whether we understood them. I mean, for one thing that we learned quickly during the 1992 riots, insurrection, was that we didn't have anyone on the editorial staff who spoke Korean. And soon thereafter, hired someone, Connie Kong, who used to sit right next to me, who did. And so the paper has attempted to address those questions over the years. I would say fitfully and not always successfully. The paper has a new editor, and I know that he comes in with a sense of responsibility on this issue. Clearly, the staff has made clear that it wants to see changes. It's a union paper now, which was not in the time I was there, and the union has been forceful on these issues. So I think there's recognition of the importance of that question, but it's a hard road too. It is, even though it's a staff that's half what it was when I came to the paper. It's still a big news staff, and you still have there's a lot of turnover in that staff, and so there are always opportunities to increase diversity. But there's also countervailing pressures. You want people who are experienced. You want people who are bring knowledge of certain areas, and those are not always going to be people who of color. And so it is a never-ending but important struggle that goes on within the paper, as it does within other institutions.
Well, after a brilliant 25-year career in 2015, you decide to move over to the more refined settings of Westwood, to UCLA, and joined their communications department and founded a publication called Blueprint Magazine, described as Journalism with a Purpose, a magazine about ideas for improving Los Angeles and California and about the people and institutions charged with doing that. So tell us about Blueprint and the work that you're doing at UCLA. Yeah,
thank you for asking. I founded Blueprint in 2015. And we publish twice a year. The goal, we theme out each issue around a particular topic and try to explore it in some detail. In fact, our coming issue, which is going to be out in a couple of weeks, is about the future of Los Angeles. And so just to use it as an example, we write about work that's going on in academia to try to study problems in the world, in this case about Los Angeles. But they're reported stories. It's not an academic journal. It's published at and by UCLA, and it's about work that goes on in academia and outside it. But it's really it's a magazine of journalism. So we have pieces in the coming issue on transportation, on climate, on housing, on a number of issues that are facing Los Angeles. We have a profile, a Q&A with Frank Gehry, the architect, talking about his vision of LA. We have a profile of Antonio Hernandez from the California Community Foundation. So it's, in that sense, an extension of the work that I try to do at the LA Times, although it's more self-consciously situated in the world of academia and trying to bring together academic research and public policy challenges in the hopes that one can inform the other and that we can try to work to some solutions to some of these problems.
And as you sit over there in Westwood and no longer, following City Hall as intently as you did before, how do you view civic life in Los Angeles these days?
Well, it's funny you should ask today, because I was just I was moderating a panel yesterday with Bill Bratton and Connie Rice, and It felt very much like I was back at my old haunts.
True civic grandees.
Indeed. Listen, I think LA civic life is always going to be challenging. It's a big, diverse, spread out place. I mean, I grew up in the Bay Area, and San Francisco has a very different kind of political culture than LA. It's much closer, much more combative. There's much more of a sense of kind of house-to-house battling in San Francisco, or at least neighborhood to neighborhood in terms of the politics. Here, it's much more media-driven, and it's much more spread out, all of which are characteristics just of the geography of the place, but also of the history of it. And I think here, more than almost any place, the newspaper, in this case the LA Times, has an important centralizing role to bring all those voices into some kind of conversation with each other. It's much harder. It's always been difficult, and it's even harder now than it has been historically. But I commend my former colleagues at the paper for the work they're trying to do. I just think it's very hard to get it done right.
And as a professor, what are you seeing from your students in terms of as they pursue this learning and hopefully careers in journalism? What are they interested in? Are they interested in the local beat, or are they interested in the international beat, or what are you seeing from the students?
Yeah, well, my students come from all backgrounds and with all different intentions. I have students who are very interested in journalism, but also I have pre-med students and students who go into law school and students who come from different perspectives, which I love. And I really am just encouraged by their enthusiasm and their interest for these issues. As to the question whether they're interested in local or national or international, I don't really have a quantitative way to answer that, except to say that obviously I think most of them are probably most familiar with national and international issues. Many of them don't come from this area, for one thing. Many of them come from overseas. One thing I would say, this is only partially responsive to your question, but maybe gets at it. One of the negative aspects of the media environment that we're in now in terms of local coverage is to the extent that we take newspapers online and the audience becomes largely an online audience, which it is for most papers these days, certainly most big papers, that has an effect of pulling coverage, incentivizing national and foreign coverage over local coverage. By which, what I mean by that, I guess, is that if you post a story online about Mayor Garcetti and you post a story online about President Biden, there's just a larger audience for the President Biden story, regardless of the merits of the stories, right? And so if you are going to measure your success by hits or by audience engagement, it tends to bend your priorities away from local and toward national and foreign, just because that's where the bigger pool of audience is. Gotcha. And that's just an additionally negative pressure on local coverage. Now back to your question, whether my students are particularly moved by that, I don't know. But I think it would be a lot to ask for them not to be influenced by that, because they too see that that's where audience is. I hope that they come to understand, and we talk about this a lot in my classes, that there is such importance and such a vital and indispensable role really for journalism at the local level, that I hope that at least some of them are drawn to that.
So over those 25 years, what story, what topic, which personality did you most enjoy covering?
Well, if you don't mind me taking a couple bites at that apple, okay. I'll say a story that I felt very deeply about and was very conscious of the role that I played in it was the coverage of the federal trial of the officers who beat Rodney King. I took that story over. A colleague of mine had covered the state case. I took it over when it moved into the federal jurisdiction. And, of course, that meant I took it over after the riots. And, in some measure, those riots were caused by the disappointment that people felt over the verdicts in the state case. So I was mindful of how much was riding on that, and the importance that my editors and I assigned to me and to others who were involved in covering it to get it right and to make sure that the public understood the case thoroughly. So that was a meaningful piece of coverage to me. For different reasons, coverage of the O.J. Simpson murder trial had some of that may be less because of the civic implications and more just because of the sense of the entire world watching it. So those were both big cases or big pieces of coverage that I felt that were important in my career there. In terms of personalities, there's so many. I guess I'll mention one who's kind of on my mind recently. I mentioned Frank Gehry as in Blueprint. One of the magnificent things about a career in journalism is I've gotten to meet so many people, so many walks of life who are so interesting in different ways. But I must say there are very few times that I have had the feeling that I felt when I left after my first conversation with Frank Gehry that I had genuinely been in the presence of a genius. And I've had the opportunity to get to know him a bit. He designed the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington. I wrote a biography of Eisenhower, so we got to meet through that. And the opportunity, I had a little bit of the same reaction to meeting Norman Lear and interviewing him. These are people who really have a special place in our culture, and they both happen to be here in Los Angeles. And anyway, they're both meaningful to me.
That's great. So, Jim, we've appreciated you joining us today for this conversation. So very much appreciate, your deep knowledge of our region and the important role that journalists play in informing the civic conversation of our region. As we say on Civitas LA, we like to give the guest the final word. So, Jim, do you have any final thoughts or calls to action for our listeners today?
Well, listen, I hope your listeners, in addition to listening to your podcast and enjoying it, will also subscribe to a paper. Democracy does not exist without journalism, and whatever you and your listeners can do to support it, you've certainly got my endorsement and appreciation. So thank you.
Well, we appreciate you being on here, having a real journalist on Civitas LA. Thank you. And a Pulitzer Prize winner, no less. So thank you for that. Thank you for this dialogue, and thank you for your service to our community. We look forward to following the progress of your work at Blueprint, and please don't hesitate to share your work with us so we can share with our Civitas LA audience. And to our audience, thank you as always for joining us this afternoon. We hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we look forward to you joining us in 2 weeks for our next great civic conversation. As we say on Civitas LA, until we meet again, stay strong and get involved. To learn more about Civitas LA and to share feedback on this program or recommend a future program, please visit us at www.civitasla.com. And don't forget to connect with us on Facebook at Civitas LA, on Instagram at Civitas_LA, and on Twitter at Civitas_LA.